This is your spoiler warning for Praxeus. Praxeus is definitely the kind of Doctor Who episode that I don't expect to have much of a life outside of its initial airing, and as much as I did legitimately enjoy the story, there's nothing about it that stands out as particularly great or the kind of episode that most people are going to find themselves wanting to revisit terribly often. And as I mentioned, I did legitimately enjoy this story. It just does many things right that really worked for me. For one thing, it's pretty well balanced and has an engaging story. We start off in multiple locations across the globe, and we know everything is related, but it's not exactly clear how. I genuinely appreciated that we got an opportunity to spend time with our main characters in different locations before they do ultimately meet up again, and that was nice because it showcased each of them driving the plot in some particular way, whereas sometimes characters can get pushed to the side when they are all taking up the same space. In particular, I was rather fond of Yaz and Graham's scenes together. We spent a few minutes with them and one of the side characters, Jake, and these aren't two characters that we get to see interact very much, so that was fun to see. If anything, I do actually wish they had gotten more of that, because Jake was there. The scenes were mostly written with Yaz and Graham talking to him as opposed to them talking to one another, so even though I appreciated that they were together, I wish we'd gotten some quiet moments with just the two of them, which unfortunately we didn't. As far as the supporting cast, they mostly work pretty well in this one. Although we have several new characters in this story, there's effectively 4 of importance. There's the character of Jake, who I previously mentioned, and he fits into this story nicely, and he's very much a kind of character that we've seen before, but he still works. He's well performed, well written, and has some good moments. In particular, there's one scene between him and Graham that I thought was really kind of great. It's almost a standout part of the episode, and it is probably my favorite single scene from the story, and that's just because it works well. Having those two characters have that conversation, it makes complete sense, and it works very well, and it's a little bit emotional, and I really liked it. The character of Adam also worked. He doesn't get as much of an emphasis within the story as Jake just because of how it's structured, but I still enjoyed him. It's not clear at first how the two are connected, but once we find out that they are married, then it helps to put the story into context. Rewatching the story with that knowledge, everything makes sense and it fits together quite well. Gabriela is a character who actually didn't work very well for me, and I think it's far more about the way that she's written than the way that she's performed. I just never felt like I really legitimately understood this character. So she had like this travel vlog, and somehow she expected that everyone should know who she was as if it was super popular, as if any travel vlog would be popular enough that any person you would randomly run into would know who you are. It was just completely ridiculous, and she acted like a bit of a pompous ass, and I don't know, I just really didn't enjoy that character, and the way she seemed to move on from her friend rather quickly felt a little weird. Just on the whole, I didn't get a great grasp on the character, and what we got out of her I didn't really like. Suki was an interesting one because she was a secret villain, which I didn't see coming, although the idea did occur to me that the people in masks were actually there to help out, which, wasn't quite what ended up happening, but that did keep the story interesting, and it wasn't quite what I was expecting, so that was nice. Ryan is probably the main companion with the least to do this time around. I do like the character, but I frankly don't have much to add about him. I'm far more interested in talking about Yaz, actually, who was very interesting this week. We saw her behaving recklessly, and it's just very interesting to see her go off on her own, seemingly because she wants to accomplish something by herself without the Doctor, but interestingly, we see how disappointed she is when she finds out that it isn't actually an alien planet. I'm not 100% sure what to make of these scenes with Yaz, but it's very interesting to see her behaving so recklessly and genuinely reminding me of Clara, specifically Clara in Series 9. I'm very invested in what's happening with Yaz, and I'll be interested to see where this kind of stuff goes in the future. The Doctor was an interesting one for me this time around because we did see her have a bit of an earth-shattering revelation last time around, but she's behaving relatively normal in this episode. And at first I wasn't sure if I got that, but I actually think it worked for me, both in terms of the story as well as in terms of the character. Firstly, it makes sense to have a break from the main story arc after such a huge episode. Some of the very few shows I've seen that have successfully had multiple massive episodes in a row are the likes of Mr. Robot and Game of Thrones. This whole review is actually just a plug for Mr. Robot. It's genuinely one of the best and most creative shows I've ever seen, with a completely planned out 4-season long story arc that ends perfectly. If you have some free time, do yourself a favor and check it out because it's fantastic. And in terms of the actual character of the Doctor, one of the things that actually benefits this episode is how the last episode ties into this one, because we see how much of an impact the previous adventure had on this character, only for her to get distracted from all of that at the tail end by what's happening on Earth. I actually think that was pretty clever, because it allowed them to show how important Fugitive of the Jejune was to the Doctor, and then show how the Doctor can be distracted by something like this. The energy of this episode really helps too, because it moves forward at a pretty steady pace, not really giving the Doctor time to reflect on what she's just experienced last week. So that was the way I interpreted it, at least, and I'd be interested to hear if people saw this differently than I did, so be sure to let me know your thoughts about the Doctor, if you have any. Also, I just love seeing the Doctor with a stethoscope. That just brought a smile to my face and kind of made me happy. In terms of the actual thread of this episode, the alien pathogen that is particularly fond of plastic, I thought it worked pretty well. Using microplastics as an integral part of a pathogen spreading is just a really clever idea, and if I'd thought of that, I'd honestly be really proud of that idea, because it honestly just makes so much sense that it would spread around so quickly, especially since the story used birds who can, fly around the world and spread the pathogen even faster. So yeah, this aspect of the story worked quite nicely, and it was just pretty neat. Although I must admit, I do think that they might have given the game away about the plastic too early into the episode, because they showed us at the very beginning that this site Gabriela and Jamila go to is covered in garbage. Plus, the birds behaving strangely added to that, because sadly, animals do eat plastic, so my brain kind of had that in mind for the rest of the episode, that things did seem to be pointing towards the fact that plastic was an important part of the episode. So yeah, that didn't really take away from my enjoyment too much, but it probably would have been more fun if they didn't put as much emphasis on garbage and plastic towards the beginning, and it had ultimately been a surprise when it was revealed towards the middle end of the story. But at the very least, it'll probably be very hard for people to argue that this episode's message was put in after the fact, like some people said about Orphan 55, because it was shown throughout the story enough that it probably didn't feel to anyone that it was out of nowhere. At least I haven't gotten that read from anyone. It's possible some people felt that, but from what I've seen, that does not seem to be a reaction, and that makes sense because it's so much baked into this episode that you couldn't probably watch it and get the impression that it was forced in after the fact. But I don't know, anything's possible. I don't really know what I'm talking about. With that said, I do have some small issues with Praxeus. The actual resolution to the story wasn't the best because, making an antidote to combat this alien pathogen is probably going to be a little more complicated than it is actually shown in the show, and you don't really know how it's going to affect anybody other than Adam, since he's literally the only one that it was tested on. But because it's sci-fi fantasy, I guess it doesn't really matter as much. It didn't actually bother me very much at all. It just wasn't the best way to conclude this story, so I don't really take much issue with it, but, it doesn't feel like the best resolution to the story. It feels like it's decent enough. And I couldn't help but feel that the narration from Jodie Whittaker felt a little bit tacked on. This again is such a small thing, but it did feel as though it was added because the episode didn't feel like it quite ended properly. If you look at the ending, then you might be able to see how, it just kind of ends and they might have needed something else. And that's just the way it came across from my experience watching. It's totally possible that was not the reason and that the narration was actually in the script from the very beginning. I would never pretend to know how this episode was made. I'm just explaining how I kind of interpreted it watching it, and, it didn't really work for me. It didn't feel like it completely fit into this episode. It felt like something that was added on after the fact, regardless of whether or not it actually was. And this is my last complaint about the episode, but I thought this tiny shot towards the middle of the episode looked particularly ugly. The episode mostly looks really great visually, but this one shot just doesn't look right at all, and it doesn't sit well with me. I don't know, let me know if that's just me or not. I just think it looks a little unfinished. Overall, this is just a really solid, enjoyable story that works quite well and barely has anything going against it. Our main cast of characters are good, and the supporting cast are largely quite good, and the story has a good deal of momentum that kept me invested throughout and genuinely interested in where the story was going, even if there was a couple aspects that were a little bit predictable and unconvincing. I had a good time with this one, and I'm going to give Praxeus a rating of 7.75 out of 10. be sure to let me know what you thought about this episode down below. I will be happy to have a discussion with you, and I hope to see you around soon for my review of Can You Hear Me, as well as a review of The Haunting of Villa Diodati. But if I don't see you again, just know that I appreciate your time here today, and with that said, thank you very much for watching. Take care, and have a lovely week.